Harlan Sanders, or Colonel Sanders, as he'd later be known, was born on a farm in Indiana on September 9, 1890. He came from very humble beginnings, and when he was just 5 years old, his father passed away in order for the family to survive. His mother was forced to take on lots of odd jobs. This meant from a very young age, Sanders had to look after his 2 younger siblings, which led him to practicing his cooking from him as 7 years old. At age 10, Sanders got a job working on a farm, but ended up getting fired because he spent so much time with the animals instead of actually doing the jobs he was meant to. His mother was furious. He'd lost the job. She told him, "You're just no good." Sanders felt ashamed and vowed in that moment he would make a success of his. However, shortly after this, Sanders' life actually got much worse as his mother remarried to a violent man who treated his new stepkids terribly. He was very clear about the fact he didn't want them, and so at age 12, Sanders moved out of his home and went to make his own way in the world. He managed to get a job at another farm and would get up before dawn to feed the animals, then go to school during the day and take on any other work he could get in the evening. Unfortunately, it was all too much, and since Sanders hated school, in particular algebra, he dropped out at just 13 years old. Sanders would go on to try a huge variety of different jobs in his early years. These included becoming a streetcar conductor, an insurance salesman, tire salesman, steamboat operator, midwife secretary, and a carriage painter. He even had a brief stint in the U.S. Army as a soldier and served in Cuba when he was just 15 years old. Although, this wasn't how he became known as a colonel, as he was only in the Army for about 6 months before getting discharged, most likely because he was found to have been underage by the time he'd turned 18. Sanders got married and then went on to have 3 kids. Of course, he needed money to support his family and decided to try and get a more professional job working in the legal field. He took a law course that was done by a male, but his law career ended when he got into a courtroom brawl with one of his own clients, which destroyed his reputation. So Sanders later got a job working at the railroad. But when he got fired from that as well, his wife Josephine decided to leave him. She reportedly gave away all their furniture and household goods and took their kids back to her parents' house. Sanders was distraught by this. He'd not only lost his job, he'd now seemingly lost his family. He went over to their house and hid in the woods with a plan to essentially kidnap his kids and take them home with him when they came outside to play. But thankfully, at the last moment, he instead decided to speak with his father-in-law, who made him see sense. And so Sanders instead went inside to make things right with his wife and eventually got back together with her. However, Sanders just couldn't catch a break, because even that would end in tragedy. In 1947, Sanders divorced his wife after one of their sons died at just 20 years old. Their marriage had fallen apart soon after because they both struggled to come to terms with the grief. So as you can see, the first half of Harlan Sanders' life was plagued with failures and sadness, but luckily, a very unlikely development was about to change his life forever. At age 40, Sanders got a job in Kentucky with Shell running a gas station, and to make extra money, Sanders decided to make meals for his customers from the back room. Given that he was a skilled cook, he put out a single table that seated 6 people and sold ham steaks, string beans, and hot biscuits. Fried chicken initially wasn't on the menu though, as it took too long to prepare, about 30 to 35, so he couldn't keep up with the demand. He knew that deep frying was one way to cook it faster, but this generally made the chicken way too dry, crusty, and unevenly cooked. But then Sanders made a massive breakthrough. You see, around this time, pressure cookers were becoming more widely sold, and although they were typically used for vegetables, Sanders decided to try it for chicken. It took a lot of experimentation to find the right settings and balance of time, pressure, fat, and filtration. But eventually Sanders figured out a way to cook chicken in just 8 or 9 minutes while still keeping the chicken's flavor. And it only got even better when Sanders tried a new seasoning blend, which he'd later call his secret blend of 11 herbs and spices. Very quickly, the chicken became a bestseller and was a massive hit with travelers passing. To help increase sales further, Sanders advertised his gas station food by painting ads on barn doors in the local area, which proved to be great marketing. However, a competitor nearby called Matt Stewart was extremely annoyed by Sanders' aggressive promotion and begun painting over the signs Sanders had put up. Sanders warned him he'd shoot him if he didn't stop, but Stewart carried on painting over his ads anyway. So Sanders, along with 2 managers of the gas station he operated, went to pay Matt Stewart a. However, when Stewart saw them coming, he immediately pulled out his own gun and fired the bullet, narrowly missed Sanders, and instead hit one of the managers Sanders had gone with. He died immediately. Sanders grabbed his own gun and returned fire, hitting Stewart in the shoulder. While Sanders didn't serve any jail time as he'd fired in self-defense, it was an extremely close call for Sanders. But the end result was his competitor was now behind bars, leaving him to dominate the local area. Sales of his gas station food soared rapidly, especially his fried chicken. He could barely keep up with the demand. In fact, Sanders built up such a reputation that in 1935, the governor of Kentucky, Ruby Lau, bestowed him with the honorary title of colonel in recognition of his contributions to the state's cuisine. So the colonel title was honorary, nothing to do with his military rank, but Sanders still embraced it fully. And from then on he went by Colonel Sanders, with many simply referring to him as the colonel instead of his real name. Harlan. That same year, the demand for Colonel Sanders' food meant he needed to move out of the gas station and instead opened up 142-seat restaurants. It had taken him into his 40s, but he finally seemed to have found success. But soon Sanders's bad luck seemed to have returned, as in 1939, his restaurant burnt down. And by the time it was rebuilt, World War II had broken out, meaning there were no tourists or travelers passing through, which had been his main source of customers. And so he ultimately had to sell the place, but he didn't give. When the war was over, Sanders started a new restaurant, which was successful until the 50s. But then the next bit of bad news came in the form of a new interstate highway that was being built, which bypassed Sanders' location completely, just drastically cutting his sale. He was ultimately forced to auction off the business at a loss, and so at the age of 65, he now had no business and no other income except his savings. And this had to rely on his Social Security check of just $105 a month. Now, there is some misinformation online that says Sanders nearly ended his life at this point, but there's actually no evidence of that. In fact, quite the opposite. Sanders was a very determined man, and he wasn't going to give up that easily. He said in his biography, "If I hadn't been 66 years old and had $105 security check coming in every month, I don't know what I would have done. But for me, it wasn't a matter of giving up. It was just a problem of what to do next." And so, despite being at retirement age, Colonel Sanders was really just getting started. And little did he know he was on the verge of his biggest breakthrough yet. And that is it for this video. To see the full story of KFC, how Sanders built his empire when he was left with nothing, I think you already liked this video anyway. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.